Okay, so welcome. I am Megan Kirby. I am the Dissemination and Implementation Specialist for Language Dynamics Group, and I'm welcoming you here today for our free monthly webinar. Been kind of off lately because I went and got myself a PhD. So passed my dissertation defense. So now that I'm back in the swing of things, we'll get going and rolling out free monthly webinars. I will put a link to the certificate, a form you can fill out to receive a certificate of attendance and use that for whatever you like. I'll put that in the chat box towards the end of the presentation. And I will also share my email in case you have any other questions, you want a copy of the slides, you need that form again. So feel free to reach out in addition to reaching out for any other questions. So again, I'm the Dissemination and Implementation Specialist and basically here for you to help make sure that you can implement, whether it's our assessments or some of our interventions. So just a little bit about Language Dynamics Group in case you're not familiar with us as an organization or company. We are committed to developing, validating, disseminating, these empirically supported assessments. So we have assessments for narrative language, so oral language, reading, listening comprehension. And then we also have, and that's called the cubed. So narrative language measures, listening and reading are in that. And then we have a dynamic measure of decoding. And we also have the Pearl, which is a kindergarten dyslexia and language screener. And we also offer intervention called Story Champs that based on tons and tons of research and just iterations of improvements based on that research. And that goes for all three of these products right now. And so if you have any questions, you're not familiar with any of these things and just want to learn more, again, just reach out to me. My email will be posted at the end of this presentation, as well as you can just go to our website, which the address will always be in the bottom left corner most of the time. And feel free to browse there. Now the cubed assessment, it's cubed as in like three things. So instead of squared, we've got, three pieces to that package of assessments, and that is free. So when you visit our website on the landing page, you'll see something to click on to download those assessments and their norms. And so if you have any problems, again, reach out. So today's agenda, it's National Poetry Month. April always is National Poetry Month if you live in the United States. And so, kind of what we don't see a lot of is inclusion or incorporation of poetry and poems into oral language instruction. It's always kind of like an afterthought, and you can teach poetry, not just, similar to Black History Month, which is February in the United States. You can teach it year round, but this gives us a great opportunity to present some ideas for you. And I'm going to go over the importance of teaching poetry, some standards that you can target or hit with some of the lessons, and then kind of ideas for integrating poetry and poems into your oral language instruction. And then finally, just some time to have a question and answer, certificate of completion form that I'll share in the chat, and opportunities for you to reach out as well. So without further ado, why teach poetry? So basically, if we think about instruction and classroom instruction, if I think back to my early elementary years, I don't remember learning poetry. And I'm not sure if any of you have that same experience, if there's actually like really salient memories of, oh yeah, we learned this poem. I remember in high school learning, or middle school even, Robert Frost poems. And I know little bits and pieces. I know that Homer had an epic poem, that we have Wordsworth, who wrote an autobiographical narrative poem. So just random things, but never, I just don't have a memory of poetry instruction like I do for storybook reading and sitting on the carpet. So, and I think it's a shame, right? We want to incorporate more poetry practice into our lessons because it's an art form. Just as writing stories and generating stories is an art form, oral storytelling is an art form, so is poetry. And it gives us an opportunity to allow students and children to go ahead and express themselves and develop a sense of creativity. Yeah, and it's an art. So we want to give them a strong literacy foundation, but that again includes poetry, because the things embedded within poetry are like rhyme, alliteration, personification, imagery. And all of those things are foundational to decoding, comprehension, and fluency as well, right? So if you've got this package together, all of it is going to make up the backbones of what we call reading. So if you've heard a really good story, you know that the type of people who go to bars and have the most friends and are the most entertaining tell the best stories, right? And thinking back culturally, over time through different languages, especially prior to the 1800s or the 19th century, poems were a form of storytelling. You know, most of the stories that were told in narrative poetic forms. And so, you know, there weren't pictures, there wasn't any writing, it wasn't freely accessible. Rather, there was writing, but it was only available to, you know, the wealthiest of the wealthy. And storytelling and oral storytelling is what needed to capture people's attention. So it had to be entertaining. And to make it more compelling, use of imagery, you know, the vivid language, vocabulary, alliteration, rhyme, your tone, your rhythm. All of those things are what really made the backbones of poetry used as storytelling. Now for us, and you know, modern day, we want to look into use of poetry for promoting oral language and literacy. So poetry is fun. Reading poetry should be fun. And I'm going to actually show you a website for you to access poems based on grade level so that you don't have to go searching and finding the materials for yourself. So they are prepared and it's a free resource, but you have to wait till the end for me to get to that. So in keeping in mind, you will be given access to a wonderful resource where you can easily obtain poems and poetry for you to implement some of the recommendations that I'm gonna give you. But first and foremost, teaching poetry to kindergarten and young children early on promotes the love of language and words. Just like I said, it should be entertaining. Poems in kindergarten and preschool have short sentences. The passages are easy to read. They're brief for us, so they should be entertaining for us, because if we're bored, they're going to be bored. And they should be stimulating, just as students are becoming those emergent readers. Now, poetry can also be used in academic language instruction. And how is it related? Well, there's three things. Poetry, you can use complex language, and the poetry that you're going to use in your instruction is what I'm going to be talking about, not all poems. You're going to use advanced vocabulary, or you're actually going to pull out or maybe select words that students are not familiar with. It could be nonsense words as well, right? And so teaching students more advanced language, both complex and the vocabulary. And then finally, the structure of language. Just like written narratives, oral narratives have a similar structure. That's kind of how we can transfer some of those skills from oral to writing without explicit writing instruction. But similarly, poems also have a structure. And if they're narrative poems, meaning they tell stories, it's going to be really a great opportunity for you to compare and contrast, you know, the differences between a storybook story and then a poem, and the character and some of those other structural elements. Now, where does this come into play when we're talking about Common Core standards? Most of the states have these standards, and these are the anchors are referenced in the parentheses. But students should be able to make inferences. They should be able to cite specific textual evidence to support conclusions and answers. In other words, what makes them so sure that the narrator is, you know, a man? Can they determine and analyze the theme of a text? Well, it's so easy to do when you've got poetry because there's not so many. And then analyze the way ideas develop over the course of a text. So again, telling stories, does the narrator's perspective change, or their mood or their tone? Poetry, it's awesome. Now, this is an aggressive slide. I apologize because there is so much to show you here. But if you're working with K through grades 2, so ages 5 through about, let's just say 8, here are the standards that are explicitly targeting poetry within the Common Core state standards. So if you need a copy of this, just email me. Then if we get to third grade, it gets really more explicit. So specifically the craft and structure of reading, we're supposed to include poems, in stories and dramas. We are supposed to include poems when we're looking at stanzas and scenes and the structure, right? Then we look at the range of reading, level of text complexity and fluency, that specific area that needs to be taught. It does reference poetry. So we need to make sure that those targets are also met. And then speaking and listening, and poetry is a great way for us to ensure that every student gets an opportunity to practice audience skills, providing those nonverbal cues as someone else is orating their own poem, right? And then switching that back and forth. And then when we get into fourth grade, again, just very, very explicit references to grade level instruction of prose and poetry, reading it with accuracy and rate. So talking about reading fluency, but with poems. And then also discussing poems that appear in classical texts, okay? So we've got some kind of like forceful or encouragement or standard that we have to meet in terms of including poetry in our literacy instruction. But we also, in addition to, the fact that poems should be fun or poetry should be fun early on and developing that love of literacy, poems can be used to improve or strengthen memory, specifically short-term memory. So learning poetry improves memory because as children read and they recite or sing a poem like multiple times, they're doing so before it's actually committed to memory. And repeating, in that learning process, repeating through reciting a poem, singing, nursery rhymes, playing rhyming games, that does train the brain to move information like more complex vocabulary words into more longer term storage. We can also have students practice, the same skills of repetition. It should also be practiced across grade levels. I'm not specifically just talking about pre-K through kindergarten, but when you're able to recall, especially when you're using words that contribute to the imagery, the imageability of like what's going on in a poem, that supports recall as well. So it's not only important for us to help students learn to commit words and the meaning of words and devices, mnemonic devices to memory, but also to have opportunities to practice or recall. So having them write poems or cite or generate their own poems using words that they might have been exposed to last week, right? Now, this is important for me. And as social emotional learning becomes more of a buzzword in education, I want to make sure that we also know what it means to include it in our instruction, especially language and literacy instruction. So teaching poetry to young children has so many benefits, right? But specific to the SEL, social emotional learning areas, it's about expressing feelings. So learning about feelings, understanding feelings, being exposed to poems that portray a variety of moods and emotions, and then students applying, text to life connections. Like, have you ever experienced a time where you also felt angry? What words come to mind? Let's write a poem about anger. But early on, like just parents and children, if you have children yourself, or if you've ever been around any, singing and nursery rhymes, lullabies, they form close bonds between caregivers and children, right? And so it can be integral to development and emotional bonds with parents and caregivers. Now, as they age, right, it becomes more important about communication, understanding of feelings and communicating feelings, but also then third, opinions. So poems as a form of art, really, there shouldn't be a right or wrong answer in terms of how one feels about a poem. Do you like it? What do you think it's about? Right? They're really, that's open to interpretation. There are people who get PhDs in just understanding poems, right? And forming opinions about what the theme is. So in that sense, it's a great opportunity for students to learn to develop their own opinions about things and to be able to express them in a safe environment, especially when it's about an important topic, right? And so you might not have the writing skills or the ability to generate expository text, like opinion pieces. You don't have those skills yet in writing, but with a poem, you might be able to express it because it's shorter and more succinct. And as we get into it, poems don't necessarily mean that you need complete sentences or we need to worry about punctuation or capitalization, right? And then it's a great opportunity if you need to work on social skills to develop poems together, and I'll have some more information about that. So if you have any questions so far, go ahead and put them in the chat. And do, while you're also here, put in the chat your background. I should have gathered that beforehand so I could tailor this presentation to you. So how do we include poetry in oral language instruction? So if you're working with primary students, preschool through kindergarten, I'm going to go over some activities for youth. Then we're going to get into students who are readers, who have the ability to read poems. And then we'll kind of end off with some opportunity to integrate poetry into other things. So great, Nicole, you're a speech and language pathologist working in schools. So I'll make sure that I can point out some activities that you can do if you're doing individual or small group instruction. Excuse me. Okay. So I don't know if you remember, if you were watching, or if you're even aware of the inauguration of the current U.S. President, Joe Biden, but there was a beautiful, beautiful poem or speech that was presented by the poet Amanda Gorman. Okay, in case you missed it, I should have put her name right there. It's Amanda Gordon. Look it up on YouTube because it was super moving. But I use this as an example, you know, for even for young students. It was very accessible language. The poem was a great example of using rhetoric, oral storytelling traditions. Apparently, Ms. Gorman actually did some research and looked for patterns in the speeches and of Frederick Douglass, Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., especially given the theme and topic about healing or uniting a divided nation. So it's a great opportunity if you have students really in first grade and above for you to play on YouTube the poem that she read. Now rhetoric, let's talk about that because I don't remember getting much instruction in this. In fact, in making these slides, I reintroduced it to myself. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that we all need a refresher and we'll go over rhetoric. But rhetoric is the application of language to increase the imageability of whatever the narration that we're doing, the oral storytelling that we're doing. Rhetoric is used, it's the application of language that's used to encourage an emotional connection with what is being told or what is being read. And then it's also used to entertain. It's used to draw an audience into the story that's being told or read. So those three things, there's a lot of little elements that poems use, that authors or poets use in their writing so that it's entertaining, so that poems become a work of art. Now, narrative poetry traditionally uses rhetoric like tempo. So that's one component, skill, metaphor, and then repetition. So those three things all direct the attention to the listener's attention to a speaker. So if you're working on goals such as oration, public speaking, oral story retelling, these are things that you can also incorporate through use of poetry as shorter lessons. You can fit in a lot more practice opportunities if you're working on a shorter poem, and then that can transfer over to practicing oral story retells, right? So tempo involves stressing certain syllables, what we would consider the microstructure of oral narrative language. So we want to build tempo as a part of building up narrative structure as well. And rhyme supports the oral narration of the speaker because it helps the listener make predictions. So if we think about rhyme patterns, the use of rhyme within poems and within poetry itself actually benefits the listener because they are able to make predictions about what's going to come next, which keeps them engaged, right? And so when we have listener attention, we're able to convey, our points and our meaning. Then we also have, in addition to how a poem that's being read sounds, how it is said is equally important. And the more vivid or imaginable the oral narrative, the chances are that it probably contains metaphors, right? And so poems are great for teaching students how to directly compare one thing to another through use of metaphor, helping the audience see with their ears. So some of the activities we'll talk about later can focus on, comparing and contrasting objects, personification, right? Having some kind of non-living thing assume animal or living thing qualities, anthropomorphism. And then we also have the opportunity to use repetition, and that can really help listeners remember key details. So if you have a learner that's struggling with recall, especially, if you're working on story recall or retelling, and they keep missing certain story elements, it may benefit to have some supplemental activities where you have shorter poems. And again, I'll give you that website soon. Shorter poems that contain a character setting, problem, plan, attempt, consequence. It may contain all of those things, but because it's so much shorter, you can read it more often in the same amount of time. Let's say you have a 30-minute session. Instead of one story in one lesson, you can have multiple repeated readings, multiple opportunities to practice recall and to provide those supports, right? You can still, if you're using Story Champs, you can still use the story grammar icons for all of these things, right? So then there's also these other elements of poetry that are great to work on. So way back, so like Aristotle, some of my research is showing through, actually specified that poems needed to have 6 things. They needed to have structure, plot. They always needed to have a character or like a speaker, right? So a narrator. Always needed to have a theme. Had to focus on diction, which we'll get to. And then they had to have music or rhythm to it, especially for entertainment, and spectacle. And under the spectacle aspect, that's where imagery comes into. So our oral language instruction can actually use poetry to teach similar things, right? So we talked about structure and character, but we can teach key elements of storytelling or story grammar. We can examine similarities between the poem's narrative structure and that of maybe a storybook that we recently read. So if we have themes of the month or themes of the week, we can find a poem and a storybook and then discuss the differences and the similarities between that structure. Does the poem have all of these story grammar elements? And does our story? Now, sometimes I'm just going to throw in caution if you're not using Story Champs, or even if you are, you will actually understand and start to notice when you're reading other people's storybooks and not Story Champ stories, is that not all stories contain all of the necessary ingredients to be considered a good story. And so you want to do some advanced planning to make sure that if you're set out to teach all of these story grammar components, character, setting, problem, plan, attack, action or attempt, a consequence, a resolution or ending, the feeling in response to the problem or the feeling at the end, when the character solves the problem. If you're looking to teach all of those or specific ones, it's probably a good idea to read storybooks and the poem beforehand and not just pull them. So anyway, so going back to this, so we also have academic language, right? So academic language that we need to instruct, complex language like similes and metaphors are super important. And we can easily work those into lessons where we're including poems, right? So it's a quick Google search and you can find some easily consumable, quick, short poems that have examples of alliteration and onomatopoeia. Also, poems provide a great opportunity to talk about different narrators of a story. I know I've mentioned it in passing, but you can discuss first and foremost, who's the narrator of the story? What perspective is this poem from, right? Is the poem written in first or third person? Often in storybook reading activities or shared storybook reading, we don't tend to discuss the perspective of the speaker or narrator, right? And so this gives us an opportunity to be more explicit about it. And then we can also teach by first beginning there and discussing, who do you think wrote this poem? Or like, what do you imagine in your mind? What does that person look like? Or is it a person or is it an animal, right? It's the perspective of a robot. And so then you can get into, well, how do you know that, right? Who do you think that the poet wrote this poem for, right? If you go back to the Victorian romantic poems, medieval even, go way, way, way back, you can have examples of they clearly wrote it for someone they loved or they pined after. But you could also have poems that come from the perspective of a family pet, from the perspective of a dog who writes this poem to their owner, or vice versa. So it gives us a glimpse into the social emotional workings, vocabulary, and perspective taking that's so key and integral to some of these social skills that our learners need. Now, here's where we get into instructional activities. So we're going to start off with just, when do we introduce poems? And I've already said like really, really early with lullabies, and those count. But how do we incorporate nursery rhymes or songs if we're just starting out with some early learners? Can we work on fluency and those activities and reading fluency if we're using poetry as our medium? How do we work on, developing complex language or structure through rhyming games? What about read alouds or shared reading activities, both within small group or as whole group instruction? And then finally, we'll get into like some writing activities and I'll be more specific there. Okay, hoping you cannot hear my swallowing. So, all right, birth through the first years of life, right? I discussed very briefly that lullabies are probably the first forms of poetry that young kids hear, assuming that they're hearing. But a lullaby that is sung to them by a caregiver, right? So that's how they're introduced. And then when they're toddlers, nursery rhymes actually are used as a form of play. Reciprocity, turn taking, speaker listener roles, fill in the blanks, we can call introverbals. And so this is where young children start to learn to make predictions about what's going to come next. And then we can move on to more advanced forms. But in the early years, like preschool and kindergarten, or if we assume that the student has never been exposed to instruction at all, then we need to start with simpler forms of poetry. So we want to start with nursery rhymes or rhyming songs. I actually suggest that you have parents or caregivers send in examples that they personally use at home. Just, send home a slip and, hey, what nursery rhymes or what rhyming songs do you all use at home? Or did you use when your child was growing up, right? By surveying them, they become culturally and linguistically relevant to the student. So we're not introducing super new material if we're going to be practicing more advanced skills. So if they need to work on rhyming, let's actually work on content that's more familiar to them. So it's not taking up more of the cognitive load, right? So they can focus on the area of language that they need to be working on. So that's one idea. Also, the second reason for doing that is not everybody sings like, the wheels on the bus. So not everybody has the same background. My parents didn't sing. And so my exposure, right, to lullabies and, rhyming songs, very minimal until I got to school. So it's a good idea to kind of introduce things that students are already familiar with so that they don't feel so ostracized if they're not. And then we also want to make learning fun, right? And so if we're using these nursery rhymes and songs, it's easier for us to use gestures and facial expressions, create small group sing-alongs. All of these things actually go back to that whole memorization piece. They help children memorize these rhymes. And then once these rhymes are memorized, we can work on picking out and extrapolating, what are the two words that rhyme? Let's look at commonalities between perspective. What is the theme? What's the structure? Who are the characters, right? What are the actions in this poem? You can pull them up. If you yourself are not a singer, go ahead and pull up some of these things on YouTube. That's what I would recommend. So this is an example also if you want to find different versions of the same poem from different cultures or different groups. I didn't realize that PETA, which is the animal rights group, has poems or nursery rhymes that they have redone so that they are more pro-animal, I guess, animal rights. So we used to have the poem Baba Black Sheep, have you any wool? Yes sir, 3 bags full. One for my master, one for the dame, one for the little boy who lives down the lane. Now they have redone that to say Baba Black Sheep, can I have your wool? No sir, that's not cool. None for the pastor, none for the dame, none for the little boy who lives down the lane. Baba Black Sheep, can I have your wool? No sir, it's my wool. So you could also find very interesting things all over the internet that are appropriate. There's nothing bad about that, but you can compare and contrast, right? From the perspective of they're both with the narrator as the sheep versus the narrator being someone asking for the sheep for something, right? So you can start that early on. Just curious if you guys have ever seen alternatives to that. Okay, then we have for our emergent readers, we can also work on reading fluency using poetry, right? So there's an example I found, I came across a podcast called The Classroom Commute, and it was episode 13, and it was poetry activities to use in your elementary classroom. And there was an activity that I thought was super cool called Poetry Voices. And what it involved was the instructor and the interventionist having a set of index cards and writing on those index cards instructions for the orator to read in a certain poetry voice. So for example, one card said, read the poem using whisper voice, read the poem using a loud voice, read the poem using a sad voice, right? So we can go into what does that mean, right? What about your voice and the vocal qualities are conveying a feeling? What about nonverbal behaviors that convey those same feelings? And then we can also straight into that. It's not only those true traditional emotions, but you can use more abstract or what I would consider advanced social emotional vocabulary words such as serious or confused. These words are rarely used in everyday conversation with young kids. Right. So we tend to hear this vocabulary, at least in my research lately too, with parents, they're using very simple vocabulary. So what that implies is that we need to actually program instruction on that more advanced vocabulary because the kids are not getting exposure to it early on. And this is even if parents are discussing emotions at all. So it was one of my dissertation studies and they're using them very rarely to talk about real world topics and uncomfortable or negative events that happened in the past, but they're not using the vocabulary they need to be to give a word to what the kids are really feeling, right? So another thing that we can do is rhyming games. Okay, so we can say a rhyme out loud, right? And we can use beats, sounds of rhythm. We can have music sticks. And so really like rhyme and rhythm, they don't need to be saved or like the music teachers or music class doesn't need to have all the fun, right? We can go borrow some rhythm sticks. What I used to do is take those little plastic eggs and put beans or rice in them and definitely tape them up and super glue them shut and create shakers, right? So as we're reading poetry that and we're going to go ahead and mark certain parts of the poem and come up with a rhythm, right? And teaching kids helps memorization. But we could repeat the verse a few times, add more expressions and actions. One idea is to ask students, if you have a small group, to go ahead and come up with, or even in one-on-one situations, come up with some kind of gesture, expression, or action that every time I read this word, or every time I end on a beat and go to the next line, then what is my action going to be? And it could be something silly. It could be something relevant to the poem. It could also just be a physical movement or action, like clapping, a stomp. So having them generate some of those ideas kind of engages them in that activity if they think it's silly, right? So make it silly. That's where I give permission to students who might think it's silly or like stupid. Yeah, that's the whole point, right? So the sillier it can be, the better. You can also take the time to check out the poem and select vocabulary words that are in that poem that do have rhymes, and have students generate a list of rhyming words that do not appear already in that poem. And conversely, having you would target or select a word that does have rhyming words within the poem, but you give them the example and then have them find all of the words that rhyme with that one target word. So these are examples that you can do in like paired peer tutoring opportunities, which I highly encourage, or one-to-one and individual work. Now, this is where it comes in. How many of you, and this would be great for me to know, do you currently have Story Champs kits or have used it in the past? I'm gonna go ahead and take a moment. Okay, Tara had raised her hand, said yes, she does. You can either put it in chat or raise your hand. Okay, Jordan. I guess that's someone else. So I'm wondering, if some of you have, thank you, Teresa. Okay. So maybe it's like half of the group. I'm happy to hear that those of you who have it and you use it, you're here today. So I imagine that you love it and you don't hate it. For those of you that do not have access to it and you're curious about it or you heard about it, you can message me later. Also, my Australia friends, I have a discount code to get free shipping. So if you're interested in getting any more or you don't have one, you're going to need to email me for that one. You can definitely use all of these materials. The storybook, you can read a story to the students and focus on that story. And the next day you could do a writing activity, right? And that writing activity doesn't need to be generating a story. It could be in the form of a poem as well, right? The story sticks. So if we are focused on a poem and want to identify certain story grammar components, those elements of the poem, some information, black sheep, there we go. We have a character. And so there are some aspects where it's really helpful for us to use some of the manipulatives that come with this. Now, another activity for us to use poetry is for our read aloud activities. So again, I keep repeating this, not on purpose, but short poems that are engaging. Okay. And so when we're doing read alouds, we want to read it thoroughly, just like we were doing if we were using Story Champs, where we expose the students to what it sounds like when a fluent reader, am reading it, and what it should sound like if they were fluent as well. And I'm going to have them listen to the poem, right? The first time I'm asking the students to listen to the entire poem. Then I'm going to read it again, right? And after that second reading, or maybe third, depends, I'm going to pose questions like, how is this poem different from a story, right? Then if I'm working on formulating and expressing opinions and that are coherent, and cohesive and complete, right? I might ask them, what exactly did you like about the poem and what did you not like about the poem? Right? I want them to be able to express both positive and negative opinions, especially that discourse is super important, as they become adults. But I also want them to think about, formulate opinions about what a poem is about. What was the theme? What was the topic? And I want to find out, can they make these inferences based on the context clues that are available in the poem or explicit information that was within the poem, right? And so I'm keeping the poem out. I have it printed. I'm not just reading it to them and relying on their recall. And then another thing, like what special tricks did the poet use to make the poem beautiful or special? And if I'm working on, complex language, metaphors, similes, alliteration, onomatopoeia, if I'm using those things or targeting those things in my lessons, that's when I'm going to ask him to see if it's making any of a difference. And that's kind of going to be my measurement test. Now, as kids age, we want to introduce classical poems, things that like are key to, literature instruction. They might be included in some of our curricula if we have access to any. So the famous poets, that stuff. But one way to introduce it earlier on, because usually it only appears in later grades when it's assumed that students are fluent readers and can comprehend what they read, unfortunately, we wait until these older grades to introduce them to this like more difficult poetry. We can introduce some of that classic poetry in the earlier grades if we're doing it in shared readings, times when I'm going to read aloud with my class together or my group. I just bring up a poem on the whiteboard or the smart board. Or if you're old school, you have it copied to large chart paper, right? So it's available for everybody. And then similar to like the read alouds, you're going to read the poem, but you could use a pointer or a stick to prompt students to join in on certain parts, right? You can also use this shared poetry reading to have students begin to get more comfortable with writing conventions, right? The conventions of written language, as well as oral reading fluency. Okay, so some of the activities that we could build in and work in to poetry in shared reading are, can we highlight or notice high frequency words? Can we notice particular spelling patterns that appear in the poem? Could we read the same poem multiple times using different voices or intonations? What about if we're working on Story Champs lessons, like some of the master lesson plans that target maybe use of causal and temporal connecting words? Or do those appear in the poem? And then if they don't, why not? Like what makes a poem different than, written text? And that's where the writing conventions comes in, right? We could also play that poetry voices game. And so if you missed that earlier in the presentation, it's just, having a set of index cards with instructions to read aloud using a certain type of voice. So it could be the prosody. I mean, you've got a whole slew of options, but mood and tone. So read the voice using a loud voice, read the poem, using a loud voice, read the poem using a quiet voice. You can build in metaphors and similes. You can, as quiet as a mouse, you could build those into those index cards as well, right? Read the poem with a sad voice. So you can work that into shared reading activities in which you may have a group and then fan out these cards and they randomly would select one, okay? Then we would also be able to talk about, like, as a group. Ideally, this would happen in large group settings, but again, if it's not happening and you have the authority to control what happens in your small group or one-on-one instruction, talk about the themes or ideas that poems like evoke, right? It's a way to work on, right, both strengthening their understanding and comprehension of language, but also how words contribute meaning to a text, right? And so basically, I would highly encourage your attempt to build in a poem into one of your lessons once a month, right? I think that's a good goal. Maybe you wouldn't start that till next fall. But I think it's a good goal for you to try to do. And then have students work on understanding language complexity aspects and things that are shared both across, some of these narrative that appear in storybooks as well as poems. Now, then we get to writing poetry. So all of this was about exposing children oral language instruction to poetry. Then we get into written language. And what we do know is that narratives have the same structure both orally and in writing. Okay, so the narrative language chains the same structure across both modalities, which is why early on, if you develop strong oral language, oral narrative language skills, students can retell or generate their own stories when they get, those handwriting behaviors down, or they never do and they can type. Um, when they get that down, then they will not have missed out on what to write, right? The how part comes, the orthography comes, and that instruction they will always get. Teachers, myself included, that stuff was always easier to teach. It's kind of like decoding and phonics is so much easier to teach than figuring out how to teach oral language. And yeah, so I get it. But some students are really slow to develop those handwriting skills, right? And those fine motor skills. So rather than wait until they master those, if and when it comes, we can help them know what to write by working on oral storytelling. Similarly with poetry, because it's shorter, if you have students that have short attention spans, getting a written narrative from them in terms of maybe a personal story, it might be pulling teeth, and now it's no longer fun. So what you can do instead is work on poetry. And what we have are the visual supports right here. This is a story starter card from Story Champs. This is all it is on the card, right? And so rather than have students come up or generate an idea of their own, you can have them pick one of the story starter cards to write their poem about, right? When we're generating stories, you can use also the storyboards that are provided on the flash drive. If you are having issues with that, let me know. It's been coming up lately. But that can be like the graphic organizer for a narrative poem, right? And so we've now got this graphic organizer visual support as well as this visual prompt that we can identify and like imagine components of a poem. We can generate it together, like as a group, or we can do it individually. But there are some things that I like to share with students about poetry. First of all, it should be easy to create. So it should not be hard. And we want to be like, it's easy, because it could be about anything, right? It could be about the rock or like the toe of the dinosaur. It doesn't need to be about the problem at hand. Like poetry should be fun and easy to create. There's no word count minimum or maximum. So as long as you're conveying your idea, then you're successful. It has unique form and shape. So we'll get there. You could work on haikus. You can really develop these later. It may or may not have rhythm and a beat. So students don't always need to fit this form, and the function of poetry is not always to match. Not always. It never is. It's an art. Anyway, so getting off track. You can use invented spelling. So if I'm not really concerned, like the hill I'm not dying on today is spelling and writing conventions. I do not care what the student comes up with. They are going to write a poem, and I am going to celebrate that. Luckily, poetry is perfect for that, right? And then poems can be serious or humorous, and then they allow the students to convey personal feelings, right? It allows us, not necessarily if we're always using a story starter card. Like if I just say, let's have a poem about a time that we got lost, right? So let's say there's a personal story generation opportunity, on the bottom of the cubed NLM listening, we have these personal story generations as an optional language sampling opportunity. And there's always a prompt there. So we read a story, then the student was supposed to retell it to us. And let's say we got through all of that. There's always this prompt that's related to the story that was read. So if we're using Story Champs and we have selected a story to work on, and our add-on is going to be writing, like we have an add-on lesson, we can do add-on and specifically just target poetry because we might be short on time. And in that case, I might actually use a similar prompt. Like let's create a story, or let's write a story, but in poem form, about a time that we felt mad, right? Or about a time that we felt left out. Okay. And this helps students engage with the text and generate it in their own way. And it allows them to be creative. They could draw pictures in this as well, as long as they're orating what their poem is. it's just helping students engage and find out that this is fun and meaningful, right? Now, finally, okay, so I promised it. Here are your free Poetry Foundation resources. So one of the things, it's like to save us so much time. If you're looking for text exemplars, there's poems on the site right here. If you go to poetryfoundation.org or org/learn/children, you can like just explore all of the poems that they have on there. But when you click on an option for, I believe, it's like all poems, you can explore right here this, the way things are like kind of set out, in which it was kindergarten through first grade. Here's some poems that are appropriate, right? And to target some of those linguistic, targets. So again, poetryfoundation.org/learn/children, great resources. Okay. Now, if you have any questions, I'm here to answer. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. Very brief. We have some more examples of like ways that you can use some of your Story Champs materials, or extend some of the lessons or the stories to poetry. But I encourage you to actually kind of take on the reverse, which is find the poems and see how those things work for you. Here's my contact information so that you can get in touch with me. Again, Megan Kirby, and I'm the Dissemination and Implementation Specialist with Language Dynamics Group. And what that means is I'm here to disseminate the research that we do behind all of our products, as well as help you implement the products with fidelity. If you have any problems, you're not seeing the growth that you thought you would get, you're having trouble getting through a whole lesson in one sitting, that's super important to do, by the way, I'm here. I'm here for you. So, and I'll be carrying out these free webinars every month. So welcome. You can put any of your questions into the Q&A or the chat box, or you can feel free to reach out to me and I will be in touch with you. And then here's some of our resources. Scholastic.com, making English fun. Those are great things to kind of throw into Google and find out, what resources you can use and what supports are already available.